Okay, so thank you for joining us today for our first CPD session on supporting our young people with anxiety. My name is Ellis Blythe. I'm an assistant psychologist with the Psychology in Schools team, and I'm joined today by Linda Brindle. Linda, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Linda. I'm a senior psychotherapist, also in the Psychology in Schools team with Ellis.
So a little bit about the Psychology in Schools team. We're a small team that's made up of highly qualified and experienced clinicians. We've spent the last 3 to 4 years sort of working in and out of schools. Since sort of COVID came about and we've had some restrictions, we've been doing a bit more outreach work to the wider system. So we've been working with GPs, with schools as well, but also with parents, trying to do consultation, education, and trying to provide some extra confidence and ability in the network that's around a young person, as well as doing some direct intervention with young people also. So today is the first part of our CPD sessions to try and help schools get some more education around different aspects of mental health and difficulties that might impact young people within our school systems. So today we're going to be using an audience interaction tool called Slido, and we won't be using the Q&A for this because Slido does it quite well. So we don't have sort of direct one-to-one communication during the session. Instead, we use this platform. So if you could go onto slido.com, either on your computer or on your phone. You don't have to download anything, it's just all on a single web page. And just put in the code 677084. It's just this one on the left-hand side here. And you can get started with our interaction. So the first question is, how would you rate your confidence in effectively supporting young people with anxiety? So it's out of 5 stars, so 5 stars sort of being the highest, and 1 star being the lowest. So I'll just give you a second to answer that. Okay, so it seems to be quite a mixture of confidence, I guess, in supporting young people with anxiety. We've got some people sort of towards the middle and either end of the scale. So this just helps us to figure out sort of where we want to try and aim the workshop at. And yeah, that's great. It's just really useful for us to see. And hopefully by the end of the session, you'll feel more confident in being able to support young people with anxiety. Okay. So our aims for today, we wanted to try and make this as practical as possible. We know that sometimes with some of these sessions, we can give a lot of education around what the background is of anxiety, and sometimes it's nice to come away with some real core practical strategies that you're able to use with your young people in schools. So that's our first aim, to really give you those strategies. But also it's helpful to understand why these strategies are going to be useful. We're not just going to be here telling you to do X, Y, and Z without you having sort of firm understanding of why they're useful in the context of anxiety. And the last aim is really to help you to feel confident in being able to use these. There's no point us giving you this session and telling you these different things if you don't feel confident or able to go away and use them. On the right-hand side of the slide, we've got a picture of a CBT cycle for anxiety. And what we're going to try and do is give you strategies that sort of fall into each of these different areas. So we'll have strategies that can help young people sort of alleviate some of those physical symptoms of anxiety, things to work with the thoughts that are associated with anxiety, and then the behaviors and emotions as well. So before we take a deep dive into some of those strategies and tools, it's useful to think about really what anxiety is and have a bit of a recap, I suppose. So it's really important to remember that anxiety is a feeling, it's an emotion, it's not a personality. It's sort of got nothing to do with strength of character or courage. It's a really common and very normal response to what we see as being a threat. And it's actually exactly what the brain is supposed to be doing. So on the right-hand side, there's a nice picture by Dr. Hazel Harrison, which sort of tries to give some imagery around what the brain is like for all of us, but for young people especially. So it's represented as a house where we've got two floors. The downstairs part of the brain is our limbic system, so where our amygdala is, and that's sort of concerned with all our emotional responses, all those quick reflexes that have kept us alive throughout the many years humans have sort of evolved on the planet. So it's kept us safe from threats like saber-toothed tigers and things like that. And it hasn't really changed much since back in those days. So we've still got all those really powerful threat responses going on. The upstairs part of the brain is our prefrontal cortex. That's sort of the front part right behind your forehead. And this part of the brain has evolved sort of over many years. And it's to do with sort of a higher level thinking skills. So things like problem solving, logical thinking, reasoned thinking, and all things like that, which we commonly called executive functioning. Now, these two parts of the brain work best when they're talking to each other. So our downstairs brain might respond with emotion, and our upstairs brain can sort of talk to that and try and reason with it, keep it in sort of an appropriate level. But when we're feeling anxiety to quite a powerful level, sometimes we can do something called flipping our lid, where that upstairs part of the brain flies off the handle almost, and those stairs don't connect the upstairs and the downstairs part anymore. And what happens there is our downstairs part of the brain goes into overdrive. It stays in control, and we're mainly responding purely on emotion. And this is very similar to our fight, flight, and freeze response. So back in caveman times, if we were faced with a saber-toothed tiger, we wouldn't want to spend time sort of deducing whether it's important to run away or, you know, whether we have the right tools to fight. Instead, we'd want that amygdala to kick in, pump our body with adrenaline and get all the glucose and oxygen to our muscles so that we can just take action rather than having to think about it. So it's a very normal thing, our response to anxiety, and it's kept us safe for millions of years. But in today's modern world, some things we perceive as threats don't need that sort of fight, flight, and freeze response. So what we want to try and encourage is our young people to be able to have more communication between the upstairs and the downstairs part of the brain, so they're better able to manage those situations they see as threats. So like I said before, it's a very common thing, anxiety. An NHS sort of survey said 1 in 6 school-aged children have a mental health problem. That was in 2020. And 1 in 5 young people will struggle with anxiety. I think if you consider the context of the pandemic, it's a very, very normal response. I think a lot of us, especially towards the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, felt a lot of anxiety because it was such an uncertain situation. Uncertainty can lead to feeling out of control, and that can often breed quite a lot of anxiety. Another survey done suggested that 67% of young people aged 13 to 25 believe that the pandemic will have a long-term negative impact on their mental health. Now, I think the key word here is believed, and it's not necessarily that will come true. We are agents and as our young people to be able to prevent this from happening. But I think it just goes to show sort of the impact that the pandemic has had on our young people. In a sense, they believe that this is actually going to have quite a detrimental effect on their mental health. Towards the bottom of the screen, there's a nice picture of what we call a mental health spectrum. And I think it's important to recognize that anxiety falls along all parts of this spectrum. So a lot of people will experience anxiety in a very healthy way. It's a very normal response to have. It helps to motivate us at times. It helps us prepare for things. If we stepped out in the road and there was a car coming, that sort of thing might help to bring us back onto the pavement. It's a very healthy way of experiencing the emotion. But it can also become quite difficult. So there might be some young people in that coping phase where they're sort of experiencing anxiety to an uncomfortable level, but they're able to manage it. And then it could get even worse where young people are struggling or rather unwell with anxiety. So it's important to recognize where our young people might be on that spectrum. But again, it's recognizing that it's a normal response that we all have, and there's different levels and stages to how we experience anxiety. So another Slido, thinking about how we experience anxiety, what might you notice in the classroom when you have a young person who is struggling with anxiety, when they are feeling quite anxious? What would you typically see from your experience? withdrawn. Yeah, absolutely. That's quite a common one. Okay, so poor concentration, yeah, definitely. So we know that our working memory, our ability to attend, can really be impacted by anxiety. We have a limited capacity in how much we can attend to something, and anxiety can take up a fair bit of that capacity and really impacts how much we can concentrate. Being more needy, so looking for that sort of reassurance, absolutely. Being quite nervous. Teary, anger. Anger is one that's interesting. Anxiety can sort of have many different faces. So we know that young people can get quite angry or irritable when they're feeling anxious. Not coming to school, so school avoidance. We're not going to touch too much on school avoidance in this session because we've got a dedicated one to emotion-based school avoidance, but absolutely that can be quite anxiety-based. Tics, teary. I'm sorry, the words jump around on the page as new ads, so I'm trying to keep up with them. Impulsivity, absolutely. Obsessions, nervous. Yes, you've got a really nice range of different behaviors that really shows how different anxiety can present in different people. So thank you so much for your answers. That's really helpful. I've got a few lists here, and I appreciate there's a lot of words on this page. So we've got sort of physical symptoms here, thoughts and feelings, and we've also got behaviors. Now, you've mentioned quite a lot of these, and some of them I thought you might not, such as the anger and the irritability. But I guess just touching on a few that maybe we haven't mentioned. So physical symptoms such as headaches. If you've got a young person who often wants to leave lessons or wants to go to the medical bay because they've got a headache, that could well be something to do with anxiety. It might not, but that is how anxiety can also present physically. Frequent colds, so sort of getting sort of those low-level illnesses quite often, and just being generally run down can be another aspect of anxiety. But other than that, you've really mentioned quite a few, sort of restlessness, the fidgeting, irritability, forgetfulness as well. So sort of forgetting homework, getting to do certain things, that sort of links in with concentration difficulties and anxiety. So yeah, perfect, well done, that's great. So to have an idea of the practical strategies that we're going to try and give you, I want to show you a video about the worry tree, and you might have heard of the worry tree before, but it's quite a nice introductory video that sort of helps us to understand it a little bit better. So bear with me for 2 seconds. Okay.
Why hasn't she texted me back? What did I do? There's no way I have enough time to be ready for that. Why hasn't she texted me back? I should work all day Saturday, but it's match day. They'll get mad at me. I don't want to let the team down. Why hasn't she texted me back? All day Saturday. There's no way I have enough time to be ready for that. I can't deal with this. I'm stuck. I don't know what to do. I can't get out of here. Someone help me. Who are you? Silly question. I'm you. What? You've backed yourself into a corner. Too many worries. I can't stop it. No, we've all got worries, but you can help yourself and get the worries out of your head. They're thoughts. I can't just get them out. Yeah, you can. You need to write them down, look at them on paper, and see what you can do to stop them stressing you out. You need to deal with them one at a time. Otherwise, you end up here, stuck like we are, where you can't see the street from the walls. Take one of your thoughts. She hasn't texted me back. Is she mad with me? Can you do anything about that? No, not really. Then you need to let it go. She'll text when she's ready. Think about something else. The exam next week. I'm gonna mess it up. Can you do something about it? I could go home and study. So, you need to study. Preferably now. And how are you going to do that? Go home, stay in tonight, miss the match tomorrow. Boom! There we are. A way out. But the lads will be angry with me if I don't turn up. Can you do anything about it? I could phone Sanj and explain. No time like the present. Hey, it's me. Listen, I have to study tomorrow, so I'm gonna have to miss the match. Oh, great. Yeah, I'll be back next week. So, was he upset? No, he totally understood. They have an extra sub lined up anyway. All these worries, they're just in your head, and you need to catch them before they get on top of you. Work out if you can do anything to calm them. Just make a note and process them later in the day when you have a quiet moment. And if you know you're going to do that, you'll see how easy it is to refocus your mind.
Okay, we'll leave that one there. So that video sort of introduced us to the worry tree, and it looks a little bit like this. So like he said in the video, he labeled that worry and sort of asked himself, can he do anything about it? And if you can, then we sort of regard that as a solvable worry. It's something that we can use problem solving for to help manage the problem or find a solution to alleviate that worry. So for example, worried about an exam and working out a revision schedule is an example of a solvable worry and an action you could potentially take. If we can't do anything about it, we might regard it as a hypothetical worry. So it's a situation that logically isn't likely to happen or harm us, but it still seems a threat. That doesn't mean that the worry isn't real. It's very much real for the young person going through it, but it's just something that we can't take specific action to problem solve. So for example, a fear around spiders, for instance, in this country, might well be a hypothetical worry. It's a situation that isn't likely to harm us. In this country, there aren't many spiders that can do us much harm, but it still seems a threat, and it's still a legitimate worry for a lot of people. And the actions that we take with that sort of worry might be different to problem solving, because it's not something we can necessarily find a direct solution for. So on that then, if we're thinking about solvable worries, so things that we can take steps to try and solve and find a solution for, what worries might you or your students have where you can do something about it? Just any sort of examples you can think of. Deadlines on work, yes, that's absolutely for us and for young people. We all experience anxiety around deadlines. Homework, yeah, definitely. Exams, absolutely. And all these things here, we can take steps to try and sort of solve the problem. So we might have a schedule for homework or a revision schedule for exams, or plan out for deadlines for work. Friendships can be solvable. If there's a disagreement, we can make a plan in order to try and bring those people back together. Worried about being singled out in class, we can absolutely take steps, sort of speaking to the teacher perhaps, and trying to discuss how that can be difficult, and then maybe working up the courage and sort of in steps to be able to feel like that's not such a worry anymore. Some aspects of social media, yeah, so it might be problem solving, such as making things more private or finding ways around that. Family worries, yeah. Okay, cool. So with our solvable worries then, something that we often try to do is problem solving. And it's useful to take this in a step-by-step manner and really break this down. If we think about sort of the brain house earlier and sort of young people flipping their lid, and that upstairs part of the brain, the problem solving part, is often detached and not quite online when our young people are feeling quite anxious. So doing it in this manner and with someone else for the first few times really helps to sort of engage that part of the brain a bit more, I suppose, and helps someone to think a bit more logically. So we'd start off by noticing and naming the problem that we want to solve. And then we'd try and come up with possible solutions or choices we can make to solve that problem. Now, it's really important here that the young person has a lot of agency in being able to come up with these solutions, and we don't just disregard a solution because it's a bad idea. So I've worked with young people in the past who possible choices might have been criminal acts, but actually it's all part of the process, that if they see that as a possible solution, it's important then to go through that with them in the next step to try and explore some of the pros and cons of that choice. with problem solving in a way such as this, it's not all about the final result and sort of saying goodbye to the worry. The actual process of going through it, processing the information and sort of weighing up the pros and cons actually is one of the most important aspects that we can do. So come with numerous choices that range from a number of different actions, and then try and find the pros and cons for each one of those choices. And then once we've done that, we can try and decide on what the best solution is at that time for that problem. And then we make an action plan. So it needs to be quite specific. So we need to include sort of what we're going to do, where we're going to do it, when, is there anyone else involved? So for example, if we had a young person who didn't want to go to a specific lesson because they felt like they didn't understand and they were falling behind, their instinct might be to avoid that lesson. Let's not feel the anxiety. Let's not put ourselves in that situation. Let's just take ourselves away from it. And that might be a possible solution for them. And then we might explore the pros and cons of that. Another solution might be to speak with the teacher and try and arrange sort of catch-up lessons, or to speak to a teacher and try and get additional work that the student can do in their spare time to try and understand it better, sort of have a different perspective. So we'd pick a solution, the young person would pick a solution sort of with us, I suppose, and the action plan, breaking it down. So step one might be speaking with the teacher and explaining the situation that you're in. And step two might be asking for work that sort of has a different perspective, to try and ask the teacher to give a different explanation to help our understanding. And three could be to then try and do additional work to feel a bit more competent in what we're doing. The last part of problem solving that's probably the most important actually is reviewing what's happened. So a week, 2 weeks, whatever time is reasonable later, coming back and reviewing how they got on with solving the problem, whether the problem was solved or whether it's still there. And then by doing that, we can reflect on any sort of barriers that might have got in the way, any improvements that we could make. And it might also include going back and looking at a different option that we had. So we might find that throughout this process, we're going back and sort of ticking off choices that perhaps aren't working. And if none of the solutions seem to work, then it might be that we have to move across to the other side of that worry tree that Linda's going to talk about next. So before we do that, I guess it's also just important to mention that it's a collaborative process to start with. This is going to be something that's really difficult for young people to do on their own. And it's useful to think of it as a skill rather than sort of a one-stop solution. So if we can do this problem solving with the young people within our school, when they're feeling quite anxious, if we work it through with them numerous times, sort of 5, 6 times potentially, and try and build up their confidence in being able to do it on their own, then eventually they'll be able to go away and sort of do it by themselves. And that's where we want to get to, really, where they feel in a position able to do this problem solving on their own without the need to bring someone else in. But that will take time to get to that position. So it's just worth holding in mind that this sort of strategy will take a fair bit of practice and repetition in order to sort of be competent in using it naturally. So I'll hand you over to Linda, who's going to focus on the more hypothetical side of worry.
Thanks, Ellis. And I guess what you're saying about problem solving, Ellis, and thinking about if we look at this worry tree and then that left-hand side of the worry tree, where if you can do something about a problem, then you do it. And I think the video clip suggested make a note about the worry and go and work it out later when you can. So sometimes problem solving you can't do in the moment. But if you encourage a young person to recognize as a problem, and once they've settled and calmed, perhaps, you know, that you might be the adult in school that they turn to, then you might be the person to suggest working through that problem solving approach with them. And what you're doing is teaching a life skill, because once learnt, it's something that we can always use. And I wonder how many of you actually are aware of other adults who seem to make the same mistake over and over again, as if they've actually not really learned that problem solving skill or learned to review whether their approach has been effective. So that's why we feel that's a really important approach to encourage young people to use. And you can use it like a standard form, very simple worksheet with a young person, and over time enable them to take more and more charge of that process, so as they develop their competence. So that's all that left-hand side of the worry tree. If there is a solvable problem in the moment, like some of the examples that we heard of worrying about messing up an exam, that's something that actually a student might have some time to do something about. So there is the other side, which often feels the harder side for people to deal with. So we've got a few different strategies that I'm going to talk through with you. So on the slide here, you can see breathing techniques, grounding, positive self-talk, and thought diffusion. So all of these are strategies which we know can be really helpful for those sorts of hypothetical worries, the worries that we can't actually do something about. I think in the video clip, the lad was worrying about someone hadn't texted him. It's not actually something he can necessarily do something about. Worry about, is my gran going to be okay when she's in hospital? It's not something that we actually have any charge or control over. It's not something that we can solve. What if I can't get a job when I leave school? These are future worries that we can't actually do anything about. So in these instances, and many of us will notice that we sometimes have those worries ourselves, as well as that our students come to us and mention them. For those instances, we need some different strategies. So we'll move on to the next slide and think about what some of the worries are that you notice that you have or your students have, where you can't actually do something about those worries. They're not solvable. Those worries about the future that we have no control over. Please, can you pop down on Slido some examples that you're aware of such hypothetical worries? Okay, complex social relationships. That's quite a broad, statement. So I guess it's sort of thinking in detail about what they look like. But some things, some relationship things are really tricky, and there's only certain things we can do about ourselves. We can't always impact and have any influence on others' behaviour. Okay, worries about how a teacher is approaching us. Yeah, worries about things like extreme weather. Yeah, catching COVID is something we don't know if it's going to happen. There are limited bits of control that we can have, but there's lots that we have no control on. Yeah, others' opinions. Yeah, there's a big thing about being in the popular crowd or not being popular for young people in school, and that sort of influence of peers is massive. Online expectations, others' behaviour. Yeah, terrorism. Some aspects of relationships. Yeah, so it's really tricky sometimes, because there are some aspects of worries that we can do some work on. We can take some care, for example, over sort of COVID behaviours, but actually those worries around the future of what might happen, often things that we see really plague young people and families, but there is a limited amount of what can be done. And yeah, the environment's a really big one, and we know for for lots of people, but young people, as they move into sort of the adolescent years, they're much more aware of the broader world issues, and so the concerns around the environment and climate change can become really big, and we know that for a lot of these hypothetical worries, they can be really crippling. So let's have a think about what we can do. Thanks very much for those thoughts. Now, I think people often say, oh, breathing exercises. They're often talked about as a way of managing anxiety, and very often I hear people that say, I've tried this and it doesn't help. Why a breathing exercise is seen as important? What we know from hearing about what Ellis is talking about really clearly earlier about the impact of the flight response on our system, the neurochemical surge of adrenaline that comes with that fight-flight response, that those physical symptoms of anxiety can be so powerful that they then feed into thoughts around threat and actually can keep anxiety going even more strongly because of the physical symptoms. And many young people, it's the physical symptoms that really feed the anxiety and almost trigger off that sort of very conscious awareness of feeling anxious in mind and body. And so why breathing exercises are really important is because we know that actually when we're anxious and adrenaline is circulating our body, our breathing, we can start to hyperventilate, and actually that creates more anxiety and stress in our body. So what we're doing by using appropriate breathing exercises is to slow down and calm down our body and bring on that relaxation process. And actually by our body being calmer, that helps to tell our mind actually that we are safe and okay. Now, one of the tricky things around breathing exercises is that people often try it when they're feeling very panicky and they feel it doesn't work and it feels really difficult. And actually what we know is what helps with breathing exercises is some good practice, a bit like learning an instrument. It doesn't really work. You can't make a beautiful sound straight away. It takes quite a lot of practice. In the same way, practicing breathing exercises at a time when you feel calm, maybe when you wake up in the morning, you could be encouraging your students or yourself to do it, when you go to bed at night, or just maybe sometime after an evening meal, just taking some while to regularly practice deep belly type breathing exercises I'll talk about in a moment can really be effective. But you need to learn the skill when you're feeling calm, so that then it's a little bit easier to apply when you're feeling anxious. And this can be a great role for, I think, staff in school to be able to support young people with when they're feeling anxious. And I guess one of the benefits of this approach that's just been highlighted here is actually, you can see all sorts of different ways to do these breathing exercises, but actually it can be done really discreetly in the classroom once a person is learning that skill, so you don't automatically even need to get out and go somewhere else. And what we know is research says that is doing good, strong, deep belly breathing exercises just for 2 or 3 minutes can significantly bring down the heart rate and calm the body. And then at that point, you'll be more able to support the young person you're working with to access their thinking part of the brain again and get that back online as you're reconnecting the stairs on that model that Ellis talked about earlier. Okay, next slide, please. So how might you do that? There's lots of different examples of how you might do this deep belly breathing. Very simple one is just the box breathing approach, where you breathe in and hold for 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, and breathe out 1, 2, 3, 4, and then hold for 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. I can't do that when I'm talking to you, sorry. And that's a simple way of just slowing down your breathing and getting deeper breaths in. And what's very important is that you breathe out really slowly. There are lots of different examples. People will know a 7-11 breathing. You can look up on the internet lots of different ways of doing this. I think for older young people, sometimes having a visual of, like, obviously you can see the box on the screen, or if it's a 7-11 breathing, and the 7 is what you breathe in and the 11 is the breathing out, so a little bit more slowly, you might encourage your young person to just visually trace a rectangle, maybe a post or something on the wall, just to help sort of focus their attention while they're doing their breathing. Because what you want to do is focus their mind on their breathing as well as their body. And for perhaps particularly for younger children, it can be helpful to be a little bit more creative in how you do that breathing. So you might do what's called the finger breathing, where you breathe in and then pause at the top and then breathe out. So you're tracing your finger, breathe in and pause and then breathe out. So go at tracing around the hand can be a helpful way. And again, you're actually, by touching your fingers, you're also sort of helping to connect and engage your senses in the moment, in the here and now, and you're engaging the visual. Another thing is dragon's breath or lion's breath, to encourage that sort of slow breathing out when you're exhaling. when you're breathing. So there's lots of different approaches that can be helpful to support our young people to breathe. And obviously some of them will really engage in particular things which are creative. And for all of you working with younger people, or well, all age young people, I think it's actually finding things that link in with their interests that will hopefully help them to engage more in something like this, which may feel rather alien to them first of all. So they'll need practice and encouragement. And I think modelling as a staff member alongside doing that breathing with them will be a really helpful thing to do. And also, if you're working with a young person, if you have a chance to have a connection with a parent and encouraging that, using that breathing at home as well, will be really useful. So that's one tool we know can be really helpful. Let's look at another strategy that you might find useful. So what we know with anxiety, if we look at the image in front of you on the screen, is that when we are anxious or we see our students anxious, their minds are absolutely full, worrying about things that have happened in the past. Did I say the right thing? Did I come across wrong? Did I look stupid in class? All of those worries about things that have already happened, or also we can worry about future events, all the what ifs are going to happen, which often link into these hypothetical worries. And our mind can be absolutely full, and that affects concentration, as Ellis said earlier. It affects our ability to be able to engage logically in what's going on, and also can when our minds are very full, we can also feel very disconnected. And some people express a real sense of disconnection with reality when they're feeling very overwhelmed with their anxiety. And when that is the case, that's when grounding exercises can be really helpful. The idea is that we're trying to encourage a refocus on the here and now. And so I guess in that image, it's trying to connect with what's going on in the moment. And you can see the image with the sun shining, or seeing the trees or the grass on the field. It's actually trying to reconnect with the here and now, rather than with all the thoughts that are keeping us busy, but also distressed. And we'll see in our students overwhelmed. So grounding brings us back to the here and now. And drawing on senses is a really helpful way of grounding us, all of our different senses. So that, in fact, what we do know is that sensory input is really very effective in bringing us back into the present. So many of you will notice that a particular smell will trigger something in particular for you. But we also know that sounds, maybe tastes, sweet or sour tastes, can all just really sort of bring us to focus in the present experience because of the actual physical sensations that we're having at a time. So that's why using our senses is really good for grounding. So let's just look at a grounding exercise that we can use. One, again, that uses a hand. It's really helpful because we have it with us all the time, is the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 grounding exercise. And it's very simply looking at what are 5 things that you can see wherever you are in the room that you're in, and 4 things that you can feel, 3 things that you can hear, 2 things you can smell, and 1 thing that you can taste. Now, often when I do it with young people, we alternate the first time we do it. So I'll think of maybe the first thing I can see, and the young person will then label something else. So I can see a lamp in my room, and a young person might see a glass. I can see some folders, and a young person might see a glasses case. And you go through that for each of the different senses. Now, I realise taste is often tricky, and smell is often tricky. And it's okay for things to be tricky, because actually it's engaging all the mind in the moment, which is the purpose of the exercise, rather than allowing the mind to be busy thinking of other things at the same time. But sometimes when you get to taste, that's particularly tricky, because you're often in rooms where there aren't things that you want to eat. I sometimes say, what would be the worst thing to taste or to lick in this room? and just to try and get thinking about something else. Or it might be, what's the nicest thing that you can taste? What would you really like to taste now? And is that some chocolate or something? So that a grounding exercise is a very simple way of trying to refocus for a young person in the moment, to calm their mind down and refocus on the present rather than all those busy thoughts that are keeping their mind very full. And there's other ways you can do that. So it might be that for another young person, they say, well, I know about that, I don't really like doing that. And for them, you might think about just actually, they're sitting in a room just now, notice the sensation or the weight of your feet when they're touching the floor, when it's touching the floor just now. Notice the sensation of your body on the chair. And the idea is you're just encouraging the young person to notice specific physical experiences in the moment where they are, again, to help focus on the present rather than all those worries. Other things you could do is going for a walk, again, walking around the field at school, if you've got an anxious young person, and just getting them to notice different textures, different colours. It's a way of really engaging them in the present. So there's different ways you can do that. So grounding, we know, can be really helpful, simple, practical exercise that just helps support young people in the moment to, again, re-engage in the here and now, which should then also calm their mind and their body to, again, help that reconnection between the upstairs and the downstairs brain. Okay, let's move on. So what about positive self-talk? Now, positive self-talk isn't about encouraging young people to say positive things all the time. It's about trying to encourage them to use encouraging self-statements that will support them to push through tricky situations. Yeah. So what we know is that our thoughts can really impact on our bodily responses. So for example, once we start thinking about food, and it might be chocolate or something else that you love, you might notice that you start to salivate. Yeah. So our thoughts can bring on physical sensations. And in the same way that that can happen with things like food, it can also happen with how we think about ourselves. And the more compassionately we can think about ourselves and how we can manage, the more we might be able to help support ourselves to manage our anxiety better. So when we're more compassionate and we perhaps reduce unrealistic expectations on ourselves, that can actually help us to be kinder to ourselves and help our bodies physically to relax more. And so instead of being in a threat state, it can help us to move away from a threat response to a more calming, relaxing response. So actually, it's surprising the power that positive self-talk can have. What it also does, of course, is it helps us if we can have can-do, as we put, coping thoughts that actually can help motivate us into action. Whereas if we always think of the problems and the reasons why we can't manage something, those will naturally hold us back, because the narrative in our mind is about all the difficulties. And very often it's common for us to hold on to all the problems in situations. And we notice those more. It's almost a self-protective strategy to look after ourselves. But actually that can sometimes really be unhelpful in stopping us do the things that we need to do to push ourselves into doing things that are helpful for us and stop us from feeling held back from the things we want to do and enjoy in life. And we'll see that really strongly with our young people. I'm sure you'll all be aware of students you work with where there's such a can't do attitude that it's really hard to think, how can we foster that and motivate them into action? So if we can help support our young people to talk to themselves like they would talk to a friend, they'll often do it more kindly and be less harsh and self-critical than if they were just continuing to talk in the way that they normally would themselves. So what does this look like, coping statements? This might be, I can do this. I've managed it before, so I can do it again. I've worked hard, I'll do the best I can. It wasn't so bad last time. So there may be a whole range of different coping statements that are helpful. So it's not about having unrealistic statements, yeah? So it's not about using things that everything is going to be all right. You know, I think you have to make sure that we're not using platitudes with our young people. We need to recognize real life situations. And sometimes it might be, I can manage even when things are hard. And the more we get to know our young people that we're working with, the better able you'll be able to help them draw on examples of when they've managed difficult things in the past, whether it's a transition to high school or an issue with bullying or you know, something with friendships in the past. So the points on this slide in the middle are really just ways of helping guide you to think if you're working with a young person or supporting a parent to help their child to identify which are going to be useful coping statements for them. So reflecting on times they faced something similar before, helping students acknowledge their bravery in other situations. And this is really nice, these even if statements, because it's very easy to get into all or nothing thinking and think everything's either going to be great or awful. And I guess that even if statements can be really helpful to recognize that there are other options, even if I don't do so well in this test. It's helpful to think with those sorts of statements, encouraging students either if they are allowed to access their phones in school to maybe have those popped on their phone on a screen that they can quickly get up, or it might be laminated on a strip of paper in their pencil case or in a workbook. So thinking of ways in which they can easily access these statements when they're pushing themselves to do something hard, then this positive self-talk can be really strong and powerful, whether it's about getting into a particular lesson or speaking up and doing a presentation or just putting their hand up in class, whatever it is, having those statements can just help tip the balance when they're feeling really uncertain about whether they should be pushing them, can and feel confident enough to push themselves into a situation that creates anxiety for them. Okay, just while we're still thinking about really supporting students, if we move on to the next slide, it's really important to think about the issues around reassurance. It's very natural for us as parents or members of staff to want to reassure children and young people to help them to feel that they can cope and do okay. And a little bit of reassurance we all need, and that's fine. But when we notice those young people that are continually seeking reassurance from us, we'll notice that they're starting to become dependent on us. And that's where reassurance is then unhelpful, because young people can then feel that actually they can't cope by themselves. They have to rely on staff or their parent to help them manage tricky situations, which can be okay in the short term, but in the long term, it won't help them to develop into independent, confident young adults. And so what we need to do is be really aware of if we're giving too much reassurance to a young person. And I bet you've all got a young person who you've had to really change that strategy with. And instead of reassuring, trying to encourage them to reassure themselves or self-soothe themselves. And we know that doing that will really create a big difference for those young people. And so on the next slide, we've got some questions that you might just want to use to promote self-assurance. So what is the evidence that that thought is not true? Have I confused a thought with a fact? What would I tell a friend if they had the same thought? How many times has that happened before? If it did happen, what could I do to cope and handle it? Am I confusing possibility with certainty? So these are some thought challenging questions that can be used to support a young person to become more self-assured. And what I always say is, if there's things that you as a staff member find that you're always asking a student, and you're always saying the same question to support the student to start to reassure themselves, then what would be really helpful is you start to actually just say, what do I always say? So what you're trying to do is encourage the student to have that narrative, to have that question in their own mind themselves. And then over time, they will start to be able to answer that question themselves without needing to go to you to seek that reassurance further. Okay, I hope that's clear and just clarifies a little bit more about how to build self-assurance and positive self-talk for young people. The fourth of these strategies I want to mention is about making thoughts less powerful. This is a really big one. So sometimes young people can challenge their thinking, and but often they can struggle to access the logical part of their brain to think logically about worried thoughts. And what we do know is that we will see in some students a real sort of exhaustion with all the anxiety that they're contending with day in and day out. And it really can be exhausting. And it's a great example of, it's like holding a beach ball underwater. You're constantly fighting against the pressure for that ball to pop up. And so instead of fighting the thoughts, it's been recognised that what can be really helpful is instead making space for the thoughts. And how do you do that? It's about encouraging young people to notice, but not engage in the thought in the same way. So spot that you're having the thought, but then to try and refocus on something else. So here it says an example of thinking about that, a way of thinking about that is thinking about skip ads. So when a young person might be looking at YouTube and you know, before the item they want to see comes on, you've got the button to skip the ads after the first few seconds, and actually just noticing that there's a skip ads button, noticing that the ads are popping up, you're noticing those ads like they're the thoughts, but then you're actually saying, right, I don't want to watch that ad. I want to focus on what I want to do today. So you skip the ad. So you've noticed the ad, the thought is there, but then you refocus on what you want to do, watch that music video or that clip. And that's quite a nice analogy for thinking about with young people, how they can notice, but then learn to try and disengage with that thought. Now, I'm not saying that's an easy thing to do. It certainly takes practice. But I guess one of the key things is remembering that thoughts are just thoughts. They're not facts. They're not automatically true. What the thoughts are the worries that young people are having. So sometimes just acknowledging and saying, thank you, mind, thank you, brain, for that unhelpful thought. You might be trying to help me, but actually I'm just going to carry on doing what I want to do today. I'm going to try not to engage in that worry. And those are skills that take time, but we know that that can be really powerful and effective for young people to reduce the power of their thoughts and get that worry much more sort of reduced and manageable, so that actually it's not stopping young people from doing actually what they want to do in the day. And that's one of the big things, of course, that we see with worry, is it can be so disabling and impairing. Okay. So the final area that we just want to cover very briefly is actually moving on from those, the worry tree, where you're looking at what can you do with the worry, whether it's a real life solvable worry that you can problem solve, or you use some of these other strategies to try and let go to a degree of the worry that's popping up. Either way, what we know with anxiety is it's really important to support our young people to face their fears. And we know that through the whole act of facing up to worries, it gives them the opportunity to discover that things aren't as bad as they perhaps expect. It gives them the opportunity to discover that even if it is hard and feels bad, they can manage it. And so that's why we know that facing fears is really important when it comes to anxiety. So you can create a ladder with a young person, and gradually work through steps towards meeting their goal of overcoming the worry. Now, I imagine that's something that you're all familiar with, so we are not spending a lot of time on this morning. But I guess what's really important is to know that when we experience situations that make us anxious, but we actually push ourselves into that situation, the next time we re-experience those situations, such as going into a class or going back to school after a big gap, it becomes easier the more we do that. So the anxiety becomes more tolerable and will usually also reduce over time. And that's why creating a ladder steps towards facing up to the difficult goal, whatever that be, of getting back into school or going to a particular lesson or joining the PE class or whatever it is, often needs to be done in a very staged approach. And what we do know is that sometimes some staff recognise the importance of taking it a very step-by-step gradual approach for the young person, and sometimes other members of staff think that a student needs to, once they've got going on this ladder, push through and go straight to the top, doing one practice at each level of the ladder. And we know that that can often be really unhelpful and actually just feed into a student's anxiety that actually they can't cope and things are too difficult because something has gone wrong. So it's better to take smaller steps more gradually and encourage a repeated practice of a step until a young person really feels confident enough to go to the next level on the anxiety ladder in order that they can really confidently build their skills and experience that they can cope with difficult things. And I guess this is relevant when you also think about things like exit cards in class. Using exit cards the right way and be really important. What you don't want is young people just going out and then not ever coming back into class to cope with facing their fear. So it's about mindfully setting up graded exposure, these anxiety ladders, with support. So perhaps a young person can do some things if they've had to leave class for a bit, support maybe with breathing, grounding techniques, maybe coming back into class and then working out actually what can they do next time that keeps them in class a little bit longer. So an anxiety ladder can be about staying in class longer for young people that are really struggling with that, for example. I'm aware I've gone through that really quickly because we're trying to cover lots of things. Let's just move on to the next slide to just see. This slide just gives an example. I'll let you have a look at that. So the function of the anxiety ladder is breaking the cycle of anxiety by helping young people experience feared situations, but realizing that they can manage it and that the imagined or feared consequences are actually unlikely to happen, that they can cope. Okay, and now let's just move on to our last few slides as we're finishing. I just wonder if you can think for a moment about what avoidance situations you have encountered in school where using the anxiety ladder might be a really helpful way of supporting a student to re-engage in things that they've disengaged with in the school environment. Okay, yeah. So classroom avoidance is a big one, and often that sort of exit cards can become, they're such a great option and give a real sense of control that can be really valuable for students, but it can also be quite a challenge if they get overly used. Yeah, speaking out in front of people, yeah. Particular subjects that are hard, or teachers, yeah. Coming into school in itself, yeah. And after the long summer break, how hard is it for all of us to just push ourselves back into the routine of work and a different sort of level of demand on our time. So no wonder how it might be for our students, yeah, engaging in particular subjects. So I think, I hope from this session you've got some ideas around some specific strategies that might be helpful. And it might be just starting off with a worry tree will be a really helpful tool for you to use. We will send out, following this session, a couple of worksheets on sort of behavioural ladders, problem solving, just to support you in using those approaches. And we can also send around the worry tree for you to sort of work through as well. We've just put a few other resources on this slide as we're just coming to the end of time. If you can bear with us for a moment, that would be great. So I think there's a couple of resources we will send through this PowerPoint for you, so you will access this information, but some resources that are specific to school, the Anna Freud Centre and MindEd. Our team do events that are specifically for parents and carers, on workshops on supporting their young people around their well-being. And then, of course, there's the psychology and therapeutic services that's part of Suffolk County Council, who offer a range of support options, including things like solution circles, where schools are feeling really stuck with a student and need some extra guidance and advice and input from the sort of education services at Suffolk County Council. Then that's a forum where a young person can be discussed. And finally, if there's concerns about specific well-being for young people and you want some advice rather than a referral to the Emotional Wellbeing Hub, you as professionals can contact the Suffolk Wellbeing Professional Consultation Line, which is run by part of the Suffolk Mental Health Wellbeing Service, to get advice over what other things might be helpful for students that you're concerned around their well-being. Okay, and finally, just as we finished on this whistle-stop tour, it would be really helpful if you could use Slido to just complete these slides so that we can get a bit of feedback and learn from what's been helpful for different ones of you here today. We really value feedback, whatever type of feedback it is, because it does help to guide what we do and what further developments that we'll offer to schools and communities. Thank you. And if we move on to the next slide, please. It would be really helpful for us, but also for you, to identify a couple of things that you really want to hold on to from the session today. This is really helpful for us to sort of know what things people feel is useful to be aware of. Thank you. Can continue filling in that, and that will come to us even if we move on to the next screen now for a couple of last questions. And this is really about how would you rate your confidence now in feeling able to effectively support young people, following on from our session. Okay, so it's definitely looking with the ones that are there so far, right? There's a change there. Thank you. And I think there's a couple more slides. Would you be further in a further 1 hour session that would help you to run anxiety lesson for students? So what we're aware is we've covered a lot of the sort of education, and we could run a session if there was enough interest specifically to help people to lead a session with students directly, like an anxiety lesson, to help teach some of those skills. So if you are particularly interested in that, I'm thinking that it might be helpful if you could email back Ellis so that we have your contact details, and Ellis actually sent through the Zoom links for you, so we could then make sure that you were included in an invite if we're offering that at a further point. Thanks very much. And finally, actually I can see, where are we? Is there one more? Is there one more, or is that it?
No, that's the last one.
Oh, that's it. Finally, we've got there. Thanks. very much for holding on. Those of you that have been able to, that's been great that you've been able to enjoy it, join us today. And I hope that it's felt helpful. And thanks very much for the feedback. It sounds like it's been useful for you. And we're always interested to know if there's further areas that you would find really helpful to have sessions on, because that can guide our planning for the coming year. Thanks very much. All the best for the next couple of PD days. And yeah, and I hope it's feeling like a gradual settle back into school, because it's a big, it always feels a big thing coming back with a new school year. So wishing you all the best. Thanks very much.
Thank you.